5 minutes. That is all it took. 5 minutes to sink the 4 aircraft carriers that had bombed Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Not 5 hours. Not 5 days. 5 minutes. Roughly the time it takes to boil a pot of water on a stove. At the start of those 5 minutes, the Japanese Navy owned the Pacific Ocean. At the end of them, the war was already lost, though almost no one alive yet knew it. But this story does not begin in the sky above Midway. It begins underground, in a windowless room, with a man in a bathrobe who had not slept in his own bed for weeks. Pearl Harbor, a basement with no clocks that mattered. Late May, 1942. The room was cold on purpose. The machines needed cold, so the men wore jackets over their uniforms, and one of them wore a maroon smoking robe and carpet slippers, shuffling between the desks like a ghost from some other house. His name was Joseph Rochefort. He was a commander in the United States Navy, though he did not look like one. He had not shaved in days, or gone home in longer than that. On the desk beside him sat a cup of coffee gone cold hours ago, and a stack of intercepted Japanese radio messages so tall it had begun to lean. Rochefort ran a unit the Navy called Station Hypo. The men who worked there called it something else. The dungeon. No windows. No daylight. Just the clatter of teletype machines, the smell of cigarette smoke and stale coffee, and the low hum of men whispering numbers to each other in the dark. They were reading the enemy's mail. For months, Rochefort and his cryptanalysts had been clawing their way into the main operational code of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a monster they called JN-25. It was not a lock you picked once. It changed its own shape every time you touched it. Thousands of 5-digit number groups, layered over with a second set of random numbers to hide the first. On the best days, his team read scraps. A word here, a coordinate there. By that spring, they were decrypting and translating as many as 140 enemy messages a day. And in those scraps, one small phrase kept surfacing. 2 letters. AF. Something big was coming. A fleet. A landing. An entire operation aimed at a target the Japanese called only AF. Rochefort was certain he knew what those 2 letters meant. He believed AF was Midway, a speck of coral and sand at the far northwest tip of the Hawaiian chain, 2 tiny islands barely rising out of the sea, close enough to Pearl Harbor to matter and far enough to be vulnerable. Washington did not believe him. 2,000 miles away, the Navy's own intelligence men in Washington read the same scraps and reached a different verdict. Maybe AF was the Aleutian Islands. Maybe Hawaii itself. Maybe the west coast of the United States. And these were not junior officers. They were powerful men, and one of them, an admiral who outranked everyone in that basement combined, looked at Rochefort's file and did not like what he saw. He thought the man was unmilitary. A commander in a bathrobe was not how you won a war. So Rochefort was fighting 2 enemies at once. One across the ocean, one inside his own chain of command. And he was running out of time. He gathered his analysts. He needed proof, not a hunch. He told them, in a line that would outlive him, that they had to prove to the world that AF was Midway. One of his officers had an idea, and it was beautifully simple. Midway had a problem no one talked about. Fresh water. The islands had no springs, no rivers. Every drop of drinking water came from machines that boiled the sea and caught the steam. If those machines failed, the garrison would die of thirst before the enemy ever arrived. So they set a trap out of that weakness. Orders went out through a secret undersea cable, a line the Japanese could not tap. The commander on Midway was told to broadcast a message by ordinary radio, uncoded, in plain language, for anyone in the Pacific to hear. The message said the island's water plant had broken down, that Midway was running short of fresh water. It was a lie, and it was bait. 2 days later, in the dungeon, a decrypted Japanese message slid across Rochefort's desk. It had been sent by a Japanese unit reporting on the enemy, and buried in it was a single detail that made the cold room feel colder still. AF, the message said, is short of fresh water. They had taken the bait. 2 letters had become a name. AF was Midway. It was confirmed, in the enemy's own words, in the enemy's own code. Now the argument was over. Now Washington had to listen. And now the trap could be set. Point Luck, empty ocean, 300 miles northeast of Midway. June 3, 1942. There was nothing there. That was the point. On a patch of the Pacific with no name and no reason, 3 American aircraft carriers sat waiting in ambush. The Enterprise, the Hornet, and a third ship that should not have been there at all. The Yorktown had been torn open a month earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea. A bomb had punched deep into her guts. The engineers who examined her at Pearl Harbor estimated the repairs would take 3 months. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the man who commanded the entire Pacific Fleet, looked at that estimate and told them they had 3 days. Welders swarmed her hull around the clock. Yard workers who normally went home at night slept beside their tools. The lights in the dry dock never went out. And in less than 72 hours, patched and streaked with fresh paint over her scars, the Yorktown steamed back out to sea. She would fight at Midway. She would not come home. The 3 carriers waited under strict silence, radios dark, because the whole battle turned on a single fragile advantage. The Japanese did not know they were there. The most powerful navy on Earth was sailing toward Midway, certain the American carriers were somewhere else, thousands of miles away, or still licking their wounds in port. They were sailing into a punch they never saw coming, thrown by a man in a bathrobe in a basement they did not know existed. Steaming toward them was a force that had not lost a battle in the entire war. For fleet carriers, the same for that had launched the raid on Pearl Harbor. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu. Together they were called the WWII, the striking force, and their decks carried the finest naval aviators in the world, men who had fought across the ocean from Hawaii to Ceylon and won every single time. Far to the rear, hundreds of miles behind the carriers, on the largest warship ever built, sailed the architect of it all. Isoroku Yamamoto had gambled everything on this operation. He wanted to lure the American carriers into a trap and finish them for good. And he had built a plan so complex, its fleet scattered across thousands of miles of ocean, that it could only work if the enemy did exactly what he expected. It was the design of a man grown used to winning. 6 months of unbroken victory had bred a quiet sickness in the Japanese command, a certainty that the enemy would always be a step behind. They even had a name for the mood of the fleet that spring, victory disease, and the cure was waiting at Point Luck. The Americans had 3 carriers. The Japanese had 4, plus a fleet behind them so large it stretched past the horizon. By every measure that could be counted, this was not a fair fight. But the Americans knew something their enemy did not. They knew the enemy was coming. They knew when. They almost knew exactly where. 0430 hours. June 4th, 1942. The flight deck of the Akagi. Before dawn, the engines roared to life. 108 aircraft rose from the 4 carriers and turned toward Midway to soften it up for the invasion. Bombers, fighters, torpedo planes, climbing into a sky just going gray. On the islands below, Marines watched them come and braced for the worst. Back on the carriers, the man in command faced a choice, and it was the kind of choice that has no good answer. His name was Chuchi Nagumo. He had kept half his aircraft below decks in reserve, armed with torpedoes and heavy armor-piercing bombs, the weapons you use to sink ships, in case American warships appeared. But the scouts he had sent to find those ships saw nothing but empty water. And then a message came back from the planes over Midway. The first strike had not been enough. They needed to hit the island again. So Nagumo gave an order. Bring the reserve planes down. Strip off the torpedoes. Load them with ordinary bombs for hitting the island instead. Deep in the carriers, crews began the slow, heavy work of changing the weapons, unbolting torpedoes, wheeling out bombs. And that is the exact moment the message arrived that no one wanted. A scout plane, launched late, delayed by a faulty catapult, finally radioed in. It had found something. American ships. To the northeast. Exactly where they were not supposed to be. Nagumo froze. His planes were half rearmed with the wrong weapons. If he launched now, he would send lightly armed bombers against enemy carriers. If he waited to rearm again, he would lose precious minutes. He reversed his order. Put the torpedoes back on. Prepare to strike the ships. And so, for the second time in a single hour, exhausted crews tore weapons off the aircraft and hauled different ones up from the magazines. Torpedoes and bombs were left lying on the hangar decks with no time to stow them. Fuel hoses snaked everywhere, pumping gasoline into planes parked wingtip to wingtip. The four most powerful carriers in the world had become four floating warehouses of fuel and high explosive, with the doors wide open. They did not know it yet, but the clock had almost run out. 0920 hours. Low over the water. They came in first, and they came in alone. 15 torpedo bombers from the Hornet, flying so low their wheels nearly kissed the waves, found the Japanese fleet with no fighter escort above them and no other squadron in sight. Their commander had led them straight to the enemy on instinct alone. These were slow, obsolete aircraft called Devastators, and that name would prove cruelly wrong. They were not the Devastators that morning. They were the devastated. The Japanese fighters fell on them like wolves. One by one, the torpedo planes were shot out of the sky, trailing smoke into the sea. 15 aircraft, 30 men, and when it was over, only one of them was still alive. His name was George Gay. His plane hit the water, and he pulled himself out of the wreckage into the open ocean, wounded in the arm and the hand, and grabbed a floating seat cushion to hide beneath. And there he stayed, a single man bobbing in the middle of the largest naval battle of the war, close enough to the enemy carriers to watch what was about to happen to them. More torpedo planes came. From the Enterprise. From the Yorktown. And they met the same slaughter. Their torpedoes ran wrong or failed to explode. Not one of them scored a hit. By any accounting on paper, the American torpedo squadrons had thrown themselves at the enemy and achieved nothing but their own destruction. Dozens of men, gone, for no hits at all. Except that is not the whole truth. Because in cutting them down, the Japanese fighters had chased those torpedo planes all the way to sea level. The fighters that were supposed to guard the sky above the fleet were now low over the water, out of position, low on fuel and ammunition, looking down instead of up. The sky above the WWII was wide open. And the men who had died skimming the waves had, without ever knowing it, torn a hole in the enemy's defenses at the exact moment it mattered most. 1,020 hours, 20,000 feet above the sea. He was almost out of fuel, and he was lost. Wade McCluskey led a group of dive bombers from the Enterprise. He had flown to where the Japanese carriers were supposed to be and found nothing but ocean. His planes were burning through the last of their gasoline, and every minute he searched was a minute that might strand them all in the water on the way home. The safe choice, the reasonable choice, was to turn back. He did not turn back. He kept searching, and far below, he spotted a single Japanese destroyer cutting a white wake across the blue, racing to catch up with something. McCluskey made a bet. He guessed that ship was running to rejoin the fleet. He followed its arrow of foam across the water like a trail of breadcrumbs. The arrow led him to the carriers. What he saw when he arrived was almost too good to believe. Below him, the Japanese decks crawled with aircraft, packed with fuel and bombs, and above them the sky was empty of fighters. Everything had come together in a single, unrepeatable instant. The codebreaker's warning. The wounded carrier patched in 3 days. The torpedo crews who had just died buying this exact moment with their lives. The lost dive bombers who followed a destroyer's wake on luck and stubbornness. All of it, at once, at 20 past 10 in the morning, over 4 carriers that could not defend themselves. McCluskey pushed his aircraft over into a dive, and from a different direction, dive bombers from the Yorktown tipped over at almost the same second, aimed at a different carrier, without any two of them having planned it together. The hammers began to fall. 22 minutes past 10 to 27 minutes past 10. June 4th, 1942. The dive bombers came down almost vertically, engines screaming, from 4,000 meters up. On the Japanese decks, men looked up and saw death falling out of the sun with no time left to do anything but watch. The first bombs struck the Kaga. They punched through the wooden flight deck and burst below among the fueled and armed planes, and the ship became a furnace in seconds. A bomb landed near the bridge and killed the captain and nearly every officer around him. The chain of command simply vanished in fire. The Soryu took 3 hits in as many minutes. The flames moved so fast that the crew barely had time to react before the hangar was an inferno feeding on its own aviation fuel. And the Akagi, the flagship, the proud carrier that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, was struck by a mere handful of aircraft, one bomb landing squarely amidships, in the worst possible place, among the aircraft and the loose ordnance and the open fuel lines. The explosion tore through the heart of the ship. Admiral Nagumo had to be talked into leaving his own burning flagship, climbing down to a waiting cruiser as fire consumed everything behind him. 5 minutes. 3 carriers, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Akagi, all mortally wounded, all burning beyond any hope of saving. The most powerful carrier-striking force the world had ever seen, gutted in the time it takes to boil a pot of water. Down in the ocean, hiding beneath his seat cushion, George Gay watched 3 enemy carriers burn and knew, in that moment, that the men of his squadron had not died for nothing. That afternoon, the 4th carrier, one carrier had escaped the 5 minutes. The Hiryu, positioned apart from the others, still had teeth, and she bared them. She launched everything she had left against the Yorktown, the wounded carrier that should have been in a repair dock. Her aircraft found the American ship and hit her again, until the Yorktown lay dead in the water, listing hard, her crew climbing down her sloping sides into the sea. But the Hiryu had given away her position, and late that afternoon, the American dive bombers came back one final time. They found the last carrier and broke her the way they had broken the other 3. Her admiral chose to stay aboard as she died. That morning, he had urged Nagumo to strike at once with whatever planes were ready, and not to wait for the perfect weapons. He had been overruled. And now he stood on the deck of the last carrier, the one hit last of all, watching the sun go down over a battle that was already lost. For carriers, all 4 sunk. In a single day, June 7, 1942, the Yorktown would not die easily. For 3 days she stayed afloat, and a salvage crew crept back aboard to try to save her. And then a Japanese submarine slipped through the escort screen and put torpedoes into her, and into a destroyer tied alongside. The destroyer went down fast. The Yorktown held on through the night, and in the morning she finally rolled over and slid beneath the surface, her battle flag still flying. When it was all over, the numbers told a story almost too lopsided to believe. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers and a heavy cruiser, around 250 aircraft, and more than 3,000 men, among them the irreplaceable veteran pilots and mechanics who could never be trained again in time. The Americans lost the Yorktown, 1 destroyer, about 150 aircraft, and 307 men. In 5 minutes on a June morning, the balance of power in the Pacific had turned over completely, and it would never turn back. Japan had been on the attack since Pearl Harbor. After Midway, Japan was never truly on the attack in the same way again. And the man in the bathrobe, he should have been a national hero. His superiors recommended him for the Navy's highest peacetime honor. And the admiral in Washington, the one who thought a commander in a smoking robe was unmilitary, blocked it. Within months, Rochefort was quietly removed from the code breaking he had mastered, sent from the dungeon to command a floating dry dock. He did not receive his medal in his lifetime. He died in 1976, largely unknown to the country he had helped to save. It took until 1985, nearly a decade after his death, for a president to finally place that decoration in his family's hands. The following year, they added the Medal of Freedom. The hero of the greatest naval victory in American history won it from a basement, in slippers, reading numbers in the dark, and then spent the rest of his life watching other men take the credit. Here is the strange arithmetic of that morning. A battle decided in 5 minutes was really won over 6 long months, one intercepted message at a time, by tired men who never once saw the ocean they were fighting on. The dive bombers dropped the bombs, but the man in the bathrobe was the one who told them where to fly. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to its final minute. If those 5 minutes, and the men who bled to make them possible, touched something in you, then stay here with us, and let us keep waking the pages of history the world believed had gone to sleep. Because there is always another story waiting just ahead. Another dawn. Another impossible choice. Another name that history almost forgot. We will see you there.